Yeah, okay. So we're going to get started now. I'm going to do a few announcements while Sham's just getting ready here. So my name's Jim White. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Welcome. We appreciate all of you coming today. Advocacy is such an important issue right now for nonprofits. We're really excited to see so many of you here, and we are going to be recording this, okay? So that's why we've got our friends here from Open Signal. So that we can make this available to nonprofits all around the state. So when you have questions of Sham, if you would state your name, your organization, and be as clear as you can, what he's probably going to do then is go ahead and repeat your question so we can pick it up through the recording, and so that people who view this later know who was that exciting person who asked that great question. And maybe they'll get in contact with you and find out more about what you're doing. So if you haven't had a chance, I want to do a couple of housekeeping items here. If you haven't had a chance to check in, please check in with our folks outside today. If you have cell phones, if you could put those on vibrate or turn them off for the time period, we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to enjoy and understand and gain as much knowledge as they can today. If you have to take a call, just go ahead and take it outside in the hallway. We understand you're all busy people, you're all doing important jobs. So we've checked in on sound and hearing. It sounds like you can hear me now. My sound person saying yes. Okay. And again, please speak up and be clear if you could. Restrooms are just outside around the corner here. If you need, Sham's going to take breaks throughout the morning, but if you take care of your own biology. So in 2017, so this September, we are launching, it's almost the end of September now, we're launching a Financial Success for Nonprofit Certificate Program, which some of you may find some remnant stuff from our annual meeting still on your tables there. We're doing that in partnership with Cornell University. That's through eCornell. We looked at trying to do this here in state with Oregon universities, and as it turned out, none of them had an e-platform and that were interested in providing this kind of a program. So we're very excited to have this certificate program in concert with Cornell, and we still have, I think, 1 or 2 seats left in that program that's just kicking off. We're also going to we've just released our survey to those of you who are members. We very much appreciate and encourage you to take that survey so we can understand what you most need. And we are also just releasing our fall 2017 to spring 2018 networking trainings for Portland, Bend, and Medford area. Those will be coming up on our website throughout the rest of this week, so we look forward to having you engaged in our various training networks around the state, as well as the workshops, which we'll add throughout the year, workshops like this. So we want to bring you the most competent, thoughtful, and engaging speakers that we can, so you can improve your nonprofit and develop professionally for yourselves. We very much want to thank and appreciate our sponsor today. Without their sponsorship, we wouldn't be able to bring this session to you today. Meyer Memorial Trust is sponsored this training for advocacy. In the afternoon, we're actually turning Sham over to the Grantmakers of Oregon and Southwest Washington, and he's going to be doing a training specific for foundations. And there is a difference in what foundations and what regular 501c3s can do when it comes to advocacy and lobbying. So we're very excited to do this again. We did this about 4 years ago together again with Grantmakers, held a morning and then an afternoon session specific to implementing 501c3s and funding 501c3s. So we appreciate that Meyer Memorial Trust gave us some funds to be able to make this happen today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sham Subramanian.
That's right.
All right, thank you. Who serves as the South California Counsel for the Boulder Advocacy Program at the Alliance for Justice. In this capacity, he assists nonprofit organizations in pursuing legal and effective advocacy to advance their public policy goals. Sham received his JD from the University of California at Berkeley and his BA from the University of California at Los Angeles. Prior to coming to AFJ, Sham was a public interest fellow at the National Health Law Program, a nonprofit organization that advances the health rights of low-income and underserved individuals and families. Among other responsibilities, Sham participated in public advocacy to improve low-income individuals' access to affordable and quality health care. Sham is optimistic about the power of public policy to produce meaningful social change, and he hopes to empower nonprofit organizations to confidently and passionately advocate for their missions and for underserved communities. So without any further ado, Sham.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks to everyone for being here. I wanted to start by just taking a few poll questions. How many of you all are providing direct services now through your nonprofit organization? And how many of you are doing public policy advocacy, trying to influence public policy in some way? Okay, great. So we've been getting a lot of questions at Alliance for Justice. How do we do more? How do we speak out? We're not really sure what we can do as a nonprofit organization. So my goal today is hopefully to clarify what you can do as a nonprofit to be able to influence public policy, to be able to educate the communities that you work with, to be able to engage them in civic engagement and the political process. So a little bit about Alliance for Justice. We are an association of over 120 organizations across the country. And through our Boulder Advocacy program, we provide trainings like these and technical assistance to nonprofit organizations on the legal rules surrounding advocacy. We also have publications on our website. So if you sign in at the sign-in desk, I can send you an email with some fact sheets, links to other resources, and also a PDF of the PowerPoint slides in case that's helpful. So our website is boulderadvocacy.org. And if you have questions that I'm not able to get to today, of course, I'm happy to just take questions as we go along. But you can always email us at advocacy@afj.org, or you can give us a call. We have offices in LA, where I'm based, Oakland, Washington, D.C., and also Dallas. And this is a free service, and we are attorneys, but we don't provide legal advice or represent your organization, but we can definitely direct you to the right resource or walk you through the relevant rule that may affect your ability to do public policy work. And really our mission is to encourage nonprofits to do more advocacy, to push their issues to the forefront. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We have announcements about upcoming events and also new resources that we have on our website, which you can download for free on our website. So I'm curious, before we get started, if there were no budget constraints, if there were no laws limiting what you could do, what are some of the changes that you would like to see in your communities to strengthen your communities, whether it's a policy change like healthcare for everyone in that community, or move the city of Portland to 100% renewables by a certain date? What types of changes would you like to see in an ideal world? And if you could just raise your hand and let me know. Over here? Housing for everyone. Okay. There's a hand over here.
Yes, I was going to say fair housing.
Okay, another for fair housing. Immigration reform. There's a hand back here. Oh, okay. Over here.
Wage equality.
Wage equality. Okay. How about over here? Defending the 100% renewable resolution. Okay, great. Any others? Yes.
Free quality childcare.
Free quality childcare. So, yeah, another one over here. Comprehensive, well-rounded education for all kids K through 12. Great. How about here? Including undocumented immigrants in health care legislation. Okay. Great. How about over here?
Better transportation for underserved communities.
Better transportation for underserved communities.
Specifically transit.
Great. Specifically transit. So hopefully today I can highlight some of the avenues that are available to try to create that change, avenues specifically available for 501c3 organizations, and maybe help you consider some different tools that are available in your toolbox as a nonprofit organization. So brief overview, I first want to highlight 501c3 organizations' rights to advocate for policy change. What are the options available to you to advocate? And then I want to talk about lobbying. And lobbying is a specific type of advocacy, but not synonymous with advocacy. So it's one way of advocating. And there are some limitations for 501c3 public charities and how much lobbying they can do. And I'll get into how you can determine what those limits are, and then how to know which of your advocacy activities are lobbying. And then we'll take a break, and I want to talk about the nonpartisan election-related activities that 501c3s can engage in. While 501c3s can't support or oppose candidates or political parties, there are a range of activities you all still can do. For example, candidate forums, creating voter guides, educating people about candidates, registering people to vote, turning out people to vote. So I want to just highlight what options 501c3s have in terms of civic engagement. Are there any questions about this general agenda? Yes?
Are you going to cover at all any restrictions nonprofits might have if they receive federal funding?
So the question was, am I going to cover any of the restrictions that nonprofits face when they receive federal funding? So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I'll mention what considerations a nonprofit would have to keep in mind when they do receive federal funding. So thanks for bringing that up. So what is advocacy? Advocacy can mean influencing public policy, creating systems change, creating community change. And at Alliance for Justice, working with different nonprofits, we've seen this take a variety of forms. So it can be testifying at a city council meeting, at a county board meeting, providing expertise or technical assistance to city council members, for example. It can involve inviting elected officials to come view programs in your communities to educate them about issues in your community to ensure that they're more informed. It can involve door-to-door community organizing, getting people registered to vote, letting them know about pending legislation, letting them know how to call their representative to voice their concerns. So it can be going door to door. Advocacy can be research, a full publication, a series of publications on a particular issue, data-driven publications, for example. And it can be participating in conferences, symposiums, networking with other nonprofit organizations to try to brainstorm solutions to various problems, whether it's childcare, transportation, healthcare. And then it can be marches. We've seen a lot of this, especially in the past year. Rallies, participating in protests regarding specific bills or on specific issues. So these are all, we all think of these as advocacy. And my main message is just that nonprofits can and should advocate and lobby for community change. And hopefully I can clarify some of the parameters so organizations feel more confident to ramp up their advocacy. So these are avenues for advocacy for 501c3s. Again, I will be sending out the slides, so you don't have to write down everything. But all the activities in green are actually not limited or restricted by the IRS. So community organizing, educational conferences, research, leadership development, for example, participating in litigation. And then lobbying is in yellow because it's limited, but 501c3 public charities can still lobby. And partisan political activity is strictly prohibited. And that, I know NAO has been doing some advocacy around the Johnson Amendment, and that's what the Johnson Amendment is. It says that 501c3s can't support or oppose candidates for public office. And then I'll get into a more concrete definition, but for now, the general definition of lobbying, again, it's not synonymous with advocacy, just a type of advocacy, is attempting to influence legislation. So there are a number of items that are not legislative, administrative actions, asking agencies to enforce existing law, litigation, for example. So activities that are not geared towards influencing legislation are not considered lobbying under IRS rules. So that's important to keep in mind when I talk about the lobbying limits. lobbying is defined in a very specific way by the IRS. So I want to briefly talk about different types of nonprofit organizations because your tax status will affect what types of advocacy activities you can do and how much you can do. So let's see. Okay, so you have 501c3 organizations, public charities, and that includes most of your organizations. It also includes churches or other houses of worship are also considered 501c3 organizations. So these organizations are tax exempt, and contributions made to them are generally tax deductible to the donor. And often private foundations prefer to provide grants to these types of organizations. Now, other types of nonprofit organizations are 501c4s, which are social welfare organizations. 501c5s include unions, and 501c6s include trade associations or chambers of commerce. So these organizations are also tax exempt. One key difference is that contributions made to them are not tax deductible to the donor. Also, they're not limited in how much lobbying they can do, and they can also support or oppose candidates, but it can't be their primary activity. So those are some of the differences between a 501c3 and these other types of nonprofit organizations. So how much lobbying can a 501c3 public charity do? So it depends. So there is a test that all 501c3s would be under to calculate their lobbying limits if they take no affirmative steps with the IRS. So it's called the no substantial part test. And under this test, lobbying can't be a substantial part of the organization's activities. What does that mean? Well, it's not really clear, and there's no clear percentage. You know, some organizations believe that less than 5% is considered insubstantial. There's one case that said that less than 5% of an organization's activities is insubstantial, but it's not very clear. And under this test, your organization would have to report all your activities on lobbying, volunteer activities, expenditures you make on lobbying, and you would have to report it on the Form 990 that 501c3s submit. So I'm curious, how many of you know if your organization is under this insubstantial part test? Okay, so there are a few. And these organizations, under this test, the definition of lobbying is attempting to influence legislation. So it's a pretty broad definition. So for most charities, there actually is a choice. You can choose to calculate your lobbying under what's called the 501h expenditure test. And it doesn't change your tax status. All it means is that your organization has submitted a one-page form to the IRS. You're basically just putting in your organizational information and contact information, and you say you want to be under 501h. And when you do that, you get a clear definition of lobbying. It's more specific than broadly attempting to influence legislation. And there's a dollar-based formula you can use to calculate your lobbying limits that's generally based on your budget. So for organizations that think they may be doing lobbying, it offers more clarity. You can plan strategically and act to stay within those limits. And as long as you're within your limits, you're not jeopardizing your tax-exempt status. Also, because this is an expenditure test, you only have to count any expenditures you make on lobbying. So any volunteer activities do not need to be reported to the IRS. So I want to go through a specific example. So you would start by calculating your organization's annual expenditures if you're under this 501h test. And then there's a formula that you can use. So if it's $500,000 or less, if your annual expenditures are $500,000 or less, up to 20% of that can be spent on lobbying activities. And then as your budget increases, your lobbying limit decreases from there. And we actually have a calculator on our website, so you don't have to do the math. You can just plug in your annual expenditures and get a sense of what your lobbying limit would be. And then your grassroots lobbying limit would be 25% of that. And I'll get into what the definition of grassroots lobbying is. So just to take a concrete example, and again, the formula is on our website. It's on the Form 990 as well. But let's say your annual expenditures were $1 million. There are all these activities in green that are not lobbying, direct services, education, non-lobbying advocacy, that are not limited or restricted. But lobbying, your lobbying limit would be $175,000, and then 25% of that would be $43,750. Another important point to keep in mind is that even though there is this lobbying limit, you do need to have funds available that are not restricted from being used for lobbying. So for those of you who receive federal funds, you may have restrictions in your grant agreements, oftentimes, in the majority of cases, that says these funds cannot be used for lobbying. So in order to lobby, you do need to have funds that are not restricted, whether it's federal funds or private foundation grants, for example. There's a question over here. And can you please state your name and the name of your organization?
My name is Edward Diley. I'm on the board of Reach CDC.
Okay, great, thank you.
We've helped support another organization's lobbying efforts. So does supporting another organization's lobbying count as for the lobbying limits?
Thank you. So Edward from Reach CDC, and the question is whether supporting another organization's lobbying efforts, whether it's financially or other resources, counts towards your organization's lobbying limits. And the answer is yes. It does depend on the terms of the grant agreement. So is it geared directly to support lobbying? Does it say, you know, we want you to use this money to influence this piece of legislation? So it does matter what you say, either in your grant agreement or verbally, when you provide these funds to another organization. But generally, yes. When you are supporting another organization's lobbying and you're incurring expenditures to do so, you would need to track those expenditures and report those to the IRS as lobbying. So what are the definitions? There's another question over here.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Gilbert, Grassroots School. On 501H, is it based on your previous year's audit, or is it based on your budget for the year that you're in?
Thanks. So the question is it based on previous year's audit or the budget for the year that you're in? And the answer is it's based on the budget for the year that you're in. And so your organization would have to make an estimate at the beginning of the year and try to determine what your annual expenditures would be for that year, so you can calculate what your lobbying limit is. And there's a follow-up question.
So, I think you said it's basically a decision you need to make yourselves whether or not you want to go 501H. When you're making that decision, I've heard people say that if you're on that borderline, you're not sure, they're afraid that doing the 501H is kind of like waving a big red flag over your organization's head, saying, IRS, why don't you take a closer look at us?
Yeah.
Whether you think that's true?
So thanks. So the question is whether making the 501H election raises a red flag for your organization or puts, invites more scrutiny from the IRS. And the answer is no. And the reason is because the IRS has said that this is an option available for public charities. You have this lobbying limit. As long as you stay within the limit, then you're not going to be in danger of either paying a tax or losing your tax-exempt status. Also, under the 501H election, and this is getting into the nitty-gritty, but you're actually not in danger of losing your tax-exempt status unless you go over your lobbying limit by a certain amount in the aggregate over a 4-year period. So it's not as if you just go over your limit in 1 year and that automatically means you could lose your lobbying limit. I'm happy to send more resources on that, but the answer is definitely no. It's not going to invite more scrutiny. And actually, it can help an organization because it provides clarity, whereas under the insubstantial part test, there isn't this sort of safe harbor. If you do a certain percentage, then you're not going to be considered doing a substantial amount of lobbying activities. I think there was a question here first. Yes?
Joanne Harable from Elders in Action.
Joanne from Elders in Action.
Do you file the H designation every year or just once?
So it's just a one-time election. So the question is whether you file the IRS Form 5768 every year. And the answer is no. You just file it one time, and then it'll stay in effect until your organization decides to revoke the election. There's another question over here. Natalie from Open Signal.
I wanted to ask, do you recommend all organizations to get the
Yeah. So generally we do. There are a few reasons why an organization wouldn't, in our view. One is that you're a church or a house of worship. These organizations are not permitted to make the 501h election. Another reason is, so you may not be able to see it, but there's actually a lobbying cap if your budget is over $17 million. There's a lobbying cap of $1 million. So for really large organizations, you may be able to do an insubstantial amount of lobbying that's actually greater than $1 million. So for those organizations, they may choose to be under the insubstantial part test. Another reason is you just don't do that much lobbying at all, so you don't need to have this sort of clarity, you're not concerned about it. Another reason is grassroots lobbying is 25% of your overall lobbying limit. So in this example, an organization could spend $43,750 on lobbying. And so under the insubstantial part test, it's not broken down into direct and grassroots lobbying. So for some organizations, they may be able to do more grassroots lobbying under the insubstantial part test than under 501h. And I'll get into the definition of grassroots lobbying. Okay, any other questions about this? Yeah, so generally we do recommend it for most organizations. It offers clarity. You can calculate your limit generally based on your organization's budget. So what is lobbying under the 501h expenditure test? There's direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. So direct lobbying is any communication that can be in writing, it can be an in-person meeting, it can be a telephone call, it can even be a tweet. And it's with any legislator at any level of government, federal, state, local. If you're doing any international work, even communicating with a legislator in another country could be lobbying. And legislator, the term legislator also includes their staff. It also includes another government official when you're asking them to weigh in on legislation or participate in the formulation of legislation. So to take a concrete example, let's say you're talking to Governor Brown, asking her to sign or veto a bill. In that circumstance, she would be considered a legislator because you're asking her to weigh in on legislation. But if you're asking her to sign an executive order, that would not be considered weighing in on legislation because it's not a legislative item. So you would not be lobbying her in that circumstance under the IRS definition. Was there a question about that? Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, there are some misconceptions about what nonprofits, 501c3s in particular, can do around ballot measures. And this is not considered partisan political activity. 501c3 public charities can support or oppose ballot measures, but it is considered lobbying by the IRS. And it's actually considered direct lobbying because the IRS views the public as legislators in this circumstance. So even though you may think of them, well, they're not really legislators, well, they are directly voting on ballot measures. So in that circumstance, they are legislators. So this can be helpful. The 501h election can be helpful for organizations if they're doing any work with a ballot measure campaign to be able to plan and say, look, we can spend this much money on our ballot measure campaign and we can act strategically. And then there are entities that the IRS does not consider to be legislators because they consider them to be administrative bodies. So for example, school boards, planning commissions, zoning commissions, housing authorities. I know many of you were talking about fair housing or housing for all. These entities are not considered legislative bodies, so it's not considered lobbying when you're trying to influence the decision of these bodies under the IRS definition. So that means that you're not limited in how much you can do as a 501c3 public charity. Yes, there's a question?
Yeah, Tony from Verde. Do you know where?
Tony from, I'm sorry, the name of your organization? Verde, thank you.
Where metropolitan planning organizations would fit in that?
So the question is about metropolitan planning organizations. So, elected, yeah. Okay, yeah, so the follow-up was that they're elected. So the question isn't whether or not they're elected, the question is whether they're voting on something that is legislative. So sometimes, I don't know how it works here, but there may be a policy that first goes to a planning commission, but then ultimately it needs to be voted on by a city council or a county board. And in that circumstance, it would be considered a legislative item. So really the question is Is it an item that's going to be voted on by a legislative body? But there are some actions that school boards take that don't go to a legislative body. They never go to city council or the county board or the state legislature. It's within the jurisdiction of the school board to make that decision. So in that circumstance, it would not be considered lobbying to try to influence that specific policy. And then for it to be direct lobbying, your organization must express a view about specific legislation. So what is specific legislation? It can be something with a bill number, HR 676. It can be the budget. It can also be an idea that you have if it's sufficiently specific. So to take a concrete example, let's say you go to your senator and you say, there's a law in Washington that's been passed. Here's the language. We want something similar to be introduced in Oregon. That would be an example of expressing a view on specific legislation, even if it's never been introduced in Oregon, because it's sufficiently specific, it's already been passed in another state. So let's say you go to your senator and you say, protect Medicaid, something like that. Likely that would not be in itself specific enough, but it depends on the context. So if you're going to Senator Graham and you're saying, please protect Medicaid, no cuts to Medicaid, in that context, it sounds like you are referring to the Graham-Cassidy bill. Or if you say, please increase the Medicaid budget by 10%, that's likely sufficiently specific for it to be considered specific legislation. So that's something to keep in mind. And then I have a picture of Justice Sotomayor because the IRS considers people that have to be confirmed by a legislative body as legislation. So cabinet appointments, for example, federal judges, the Senate has to vote to confirm them. So because the Senate is voting to confirm, they're considered legislation. So if you say, please vote no, or please vote yes on this nominee, that would be considered lobbying. And then if you are preparing to lobby, you would also need to count those activities as lobbying. So if you're spending money printing out flyers that you're going to hand to different legislators, you would have to count those costs as lobbying as well, not just the time you spent making the ask of a specific legislator. And there are a number of items, as I mentioned before, that are not legislation. So regulations, executive orders, enforcement of existing laws, litigation. One thing I'll note about this is that for those of you receiving federal funding, they may define lobbying a little bit differently. So you want to make sure you understand what activities the federal government is prohibiting. It may include trying to influence administrative actions. But for purpose of your 501c3 and what are the rules that apply to your organization because of your tax status, it wouldn't be considered lobbying to try to influence these administrative actions. There's a question over here.
Actually, that was pretty personal. Cam from Rosewood Initiative.
Cam from Rosewood Initiative.
And in Portland, we have a commission system where our city council commissioners are also the administrative, or ahead of the administrative bureaus. And so if I'm going to one of them to talk about a specific project, trying to get it into my area, would that be considered administrative or would that be legislative?
Yeah, so the question is about, and correct me if I'm not characterizing this correctly, so city council members also act as commissioners and may serve in an administrative capacity in addition to their role as city council members. Is that?
Correct.
Okay. So in that circumstance, the question is not who you're talking to, is what is the policy you're trying to influence? So there may be administrative actions that the commission is taking. I'm not sure in Portland how it works, or in Oregon, but if it's not going to a legislative body, then it would be an administrative action. So that's really the question that you have to ask is, who's voting on it in terms of the body that's voting on it, not just the individual, if the individual is a city council member, if they're not acting in that capacity. Okay, so I want to go through some specific examples. So let's say you're urging city council members to pass a local minimum wage ordinance. This would be considered lobbying because you're directly asking them to express a view. Let's say you're meeting with local police and asking them to stop racial profiling. There's no new law here that people have to pass. And then if you're talking to the Attorney General and you're asking them to weigh in on a state bill, and you're also asking the Attorney General to prosecute a bank for redlining. The first part would be lobbying because you're asking the government official to weigh in on a state bill, but the second part is within the jurisdiction of the Attorney General and does not require a new law. So that's why that part would not be lobbying. And then the last part is just education. You're not asking them to pass a new law, you're just saying, this is where public opinion is on climate change, and the government needs to act. But you're not saying, this means that we need to defend the renewable energy renewable energy goals in this particular way. So what about grassroots lobbying? Are any organizations working with communities to try to get them involved, to try to call their legislators or weigh in on bills? Okay. So grassroots lobbying is when you're communicating with the public, not with government officials or other legislators. And you're still expressing a view on specific legislation. So, we oppose Graham Cassidy, for example. But there also needs to be a call to action. So a call to action is either you're telling people to contact their legislator, you're providing contact information like a phone number, an email address, mailing address, so people know where to submit their comments, or you're giving them a way to contact their legislator like a petition, a tear-off postcard, those kinds of things. Or you're identifying legislators in certain ways. So you're saying, Senator Wyden sits on this committee, or this senator is undecided, and so that's why we need to target this person. Okay. So it looks like we have the PDF version, but just not looking at this, do you all think that this has a call to action in it? This communication, it says, call Congress to pass the DREAM Act and tune in for the vote. Yeah, so it says call Congress, and there's also the phone numbers. And here's another example of a call to action. So it says, take action to make California Bill of Rights a reality for domestic workers. So you have the phone numbers there for people who sit on the Appropriations Committee. And then this is communication from NRDC. And it says, urge your representative not to harm California's water and wildlife. It has a petition. So it's, it's giving people a way to contact their legislator. So what are some examples of communications that don't have calls to action? And so if it doesn't have a call to action, that means that it would not be grassroots lobbying when you're communicating with the public. So let's say you just said learn more or take action or support our efforts. Those actually are not calls to action. You need to have the contact information or give them a way to contact, or you're identifying certain legislators. So does this have a call to action? It's about raising the cigarette tax in Maine. Do people think this has a call to action? Yeah, so it says tell the legislature, and it also has phone numbers. So what if this was a ballot measure and you're distributing it to the public? Do people think this would be considered lobbying? Yes, so it would be because you're telling, let's say it's telling the public, raise the cigarette tax. What about if you hand this to a legislator? Would this be considered direct lobbying? Yeah, so you're expressing a view about specific legislation. What about here? Why do people think this is not lobbying? It says, just raise the cigarette tax. Anyone have any ideas about why this wouldn't be over here? Yeah, so one answer was there's no contact information. Another one here?
No legislator identified or legislation specific.
Yeah, so another comment was there's no legislator identified. Another comment over here?
No specificity.
No specificity. So yeah, there are a number of reasons why this may not be lobbying. So let's assume they are referring to a bill that's pending in the state legislature, and it's very clear they're referring to that. Even then, this doesn't have a call to action because it doesn't have any contact information. It's not giving people a way to contact them. It's not even saying contact your legislator. It's not identifying any legislators. Okay, so I know this is kind of small, but it says no paid sick days for restaurant employees, an enhanced dining experience for restaurant customers, and then at the bottom it says contact your legislator and share your support of LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. Do people think this is grassroots lobbying? Yeah, so it says contact your legislator, refers to specific legislation. So here's another one. It says, she'll be your server tonight, and she's pretty sure it's contagious. Nearly half of all workers in Maine lack paid sick days and are forced to work through their illnesses in order to pay the bills. Support LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. Do people think this is grassroots lobbying? So almost everyone says yes, but this actually would not be. There's no call to action here. So you are seeing support. You're clearly expressing a view, but you're not asking people to contact their legislator. You're not giving contact information. Now, if the link at the bottom goes to a petition, then you likely couldn't say that this is not grassroots lobbying. But let's say it doesn't. There's nothing in this communication that has a call to action, that is a call to action. So this just goes to show that, under the 501H test, another benefit is that there's clarity as to when your communications are grassroots lobbying and when they're not. And you can plan accordingly. Again, even if they are grassroots lobbying, you still are permitted to do it. You just would need to track and report the costs that you incur on those lobbying activities. Okay. Any questions about grassroots lobbying? Or I move on. There's a question back here. Steve with Sage.
Wondering if the states like Oregon, Maine, if they modify the lobbying and grassroots lobbying laws so that you have to worry about state overlay.
Yeah, so the question is about Oregon state law. So many jurisdictions, states or locally, have their own lobbying rules. And these apply to all organizations that are trying to influence policy in the state, not just 501c3s. And so they may have different definitions of lobbying, but typically the case is that there are certain thresholds that your organization would need to reach before you'd need to start reporting to the state or the locality. So you would need to be mindful of those state or local definitions of lobbying and how they're different. But this is for when you're reporting to the IRS, and it's also especially important because these rules impose limits, whereas those rules typically are about disclosure and not about limitations on your lobbying activities. Question over here.
Natalie, Seth with Advocacy. When you start lobbying city or state, well, specifically like City of Portland, they will have thresholds of which you need to start reporting. And I believe City of Portland is 8 hours fine or over $1,000 towards lobbying. But Deborah Scroggins can answer this question.
Thanks. So Natalie from Open Signal was just describing the thresholds in the city of Portland, just to reiterate the point that you need to do a certain amount or spend a certain amount in order to have to report to the city of Portland. Question over here.
Romeo with Vos.
Romeo with Vos.
Yeah, I have a question. This is not a bill, but it's a case like the Department of Homeland Security. They have a plan to arrest and deport like 8,000 people. They call it Operation Mega. So what we did is we went to the commission, city commissioners and the county commission to oppose that plan. So is that considered like lobbying?
Yeah, so let's see if I get this question right. So the question is, the Department of Homeland Security is finalizing a plan to deport people called Operation Mega, and the organization wants to go to city council or the county board to ask them to oppose the plan and to not participate. Let me ask you, would it require an ordinance to be passed or a resolution?
No, it's a plan. It already exists. But
Yeah,
they
okay.
hide it.
Okay,
They didn't tell the public
Yeah.
until we discovered it. So it's a hiding plan. It's already planned.
yeah. So it's already a plan, but what are you asking the city council to do exactly?
To make a public statement to
Okay.
oppose that plan.
Got it, okay. So the question is, they want to ask the city council to make a public statement to oppose that plan. If you're asking the city council to pass a resolution, then that is considered legislation. But if you're just asking city council members to speak out, that in itself is not specific legislation. Or if you're asking, let's say, local police to not cooperate with ICE, that's not considered lobbying because you're not asking for a new law to be passed. So the real question is, are you asking city council to pass an ordinance about this, or are you asking them to pass a resolution about this? And if not, and you're just asking them to speak out about it, then it's not considered trying to influence legislation. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay. So there are a number of, oh yes, Jim.
So Jim, NAO, his question makes me wonder though, what would happen if they took this to their city council and the city council then acted very quickly? So they're not asking them to pass something, but 48 hours later,
Sure.
the council itself decides, whoa, we didn't know about this, you educated us, we're going to now pass some kind of a
Right.
resolution that will forbid local authorities from participating in this
Okay.
suite. So
Great. So
do you have to report retroactively, I guess?
right. So Jim from NAO asks, what if you ask them to speak out, but then the city council says we're going to pass an ordinance or a resolution 48 hours later? It really depends what your organization is asking for. So if you just say, we urge city council members to speak out about this, then you're not responsible for the city council deciding on its own to enact an ordinance. So it really depends what you're asking. I mean, the other point I want to make is, I don't want organizations to feel like if it is lobbying, they can't do it. But you just have to be mindful that it is lobbying. You may decide that it's more impactful to say, we want you to enact a resolution or pass a new ordinance. And that would be lobbying. But it's still permitted for 501c3 public charities. But again, it's what you're asking them to do, not what they decide to do independently. So there are a number of activities that you may think of on first glance as lobbying, but the IRS has said there are actually exceptions to the definition of lobbying. So one is nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. So this is when you have a full and fair discussion of an issue. So not a bumper sticker, a short radio spot, but a report, a brief or series of briefs. And you discuss both sides of an issue. You have enough data in there so a third party can come to their own conclusion about the issue. And you can still express a view and hand it to legislators. It should be distributed to all legislators on both sides of the aisle. But if you prepare a report like this, it won't be considered lobbying. So this can be helpful for those of you who are doing intensive research. If it's structured in a way that you're looking at both sides, it's a fair discussion of the issue, you can still express a view on legislation, say, hey, we've looked at healthcare and we think that this is our recommendation for legislation, and you can pass that to legislators without it being considered lobbying. There's a question here. Sorry, Lena with? Lee with Mercy Corps Northwest. Thank you.
My question is, are you allowed to, in a publication, in a nonpartisan publication that you produce, introduce your own conclusions at the end of that publication, or can they not be included in the publication?
Yeah, so, right. So the question is, are you allowed to introduce your own conclusions? And the answer is yes. So you can come to a conclusion. You can say, we've looked at both sides, we've analyzed the evidence, and we conclude that this is the best legislation that should be introduced. So that is permitted even under this exception. And that's really what it's meant to try to apply to, is to allow nonprofits to do research and provide it to legislators to educate them on issues, as long as it's done in a full and fair way. Another exception is called request for technical assistance. So this is when you get an invitation in writing from a committee or subcommittee asking your organization to come in and provide input and express a view on legislation. So if you receive this invitation in writing, and it's from a committee, not just from an individual legislator, then it's considered a response to request for technical assistance, and you don't need to count that as lobbying. So this can be useful for many of you if you're doing a lot of testimony in front of city council. You can ask them, and maybe they're used to this, say, please give us the invitation in writing, outline the scope of the request, and as long as you're within that, the scope, then you can provide your input even on legislation. Yeah, a question over here. Yeah. The question is, if it's from an individual council member, would that qualify for the exception? The answer is no. So unless the individual council member is acting on behalf of the committee, like there's a committee letterhead and they say, please provide your input to every member of the committee, in that circumstance, then that would be a sufficient invitation. Okay, so another exception is self-defense. And this is when you're advocating around issues that affect nonprofits' powers and duties, the tax deductibility of charitable contributions, Yeah, so Council on Foundations has taken the position that advocacy around the Johnson Amendment is considered self-defense. So to say, don't repeal the Johnson Amendment because it says that 501c3s can't support or oppose candidates, that would be considered self-defense advocacy, so it's not lobbying. The important point about this is self-defense is only for direct lobbying. So it doesn't apply when you're trying to do grassroots lobbying, even if it's on something that would affect the powers and duties of an organization. But so you're permitted to tell your Congress member, please don't eliminate the charitable deduction for 501c3s, and that would be considered self-defense. You would need to count it towards your lobbying limits. And then another exception is just an examination and discussion of an issue. So a blue ribbon commission, a symposium, people are brainstorming solutions, but they're not at the point where they're trying to talk about specific legislation or push a specific proposal. So we have a lot of information, a lot of publications that go into more detail. You can also email us, advocacy@afj.org, or give us a call. And we also have some tools if you're thinking about assessing your capacity to do advocacy. Is our media relations strong? Is our field organization strong? Do we need to improve in research or electoral work? You can use those tools to try to figure out what are your strengths and maybe where you need to partner with other organizations. So that can be helpful as well. Was there a question over here? No, okay. So a few key points. Oh yeah, question over here.
Steve Mazur with Social Action Partners. I'm curious, several of these things like producing research, whether it's got to be full and fair,
Yeah.
and the self-defense, it's like who bears the burden of demonstrating whether something is full or fair or self-defense? Meaning, if you put out a research
Right.
monograph, do you have to be aware that you're going to have to prove that it's full and fair, or is
Yeah.
the burden on government to prove that it isn't? If they want to, if someone wants to take it,
Yeah.
that could be very costly.
Right.
Who bears the burden of that?
Right. So the question is about, and Steve from Social Venture Partners, right? And the question is about, who bears the burden of proving that research, for example, is nonpartisan? Is it the government or is it the nonprofit organization? So practically how it would come up is you decide to put out a report and you say, okay, we've decided this is nonpartisan, it's full and fair, we've looked at the criteria, we believe this meets it. And then maybe someone complains, maybe in some opposing organization, complains to the IRS. Maybe the IRS decides to investigate it. And the IRS says, we believe this is nonpartisan. You provide that information as to why you think it was nonpartisan. Maybe the IRS decides to pursue a case, and then that issue is resolved in a court case, for example. Or they decide they're happy with your explanation, and they decide not to push it further. So it really depends on the case. But I think if you are trying to stay within this exception, you may want to consult with an attorney or have some kind of written opinion as to why you believe this is nonpartisan analysis, so you'll be able to justify it. But to answer your question, it would just be resolved on a case-by-case basis. There isn't sort of one way it would be resolved in all cases. Two questions over here.
Chris with Oregon Environmental Council. To follow up on that question, I'm confused about why a publication would fall into lobbying anyway.
Yeah.
If it doesn't say to legislator, we want you to take this action on this bill. So I'm not even
Yeah.
sure why a publication would even be
Right.
have the potential to be direct lobbying if it didn't have those three characteristics.
Right. So Chris from Oregon Environmental Council, is that right? So the question is, why would a research publication even need to be under the exception if it's not expressing a view? Well, it would only need to fall under that exception if it does express a view. So I'm looking at publications that discuss an issue and then at the end say, we urge you for these reasons to vote yes on HR 26. So in that circumstance, you might want to use the exception. If you're not talking about specific legislation at all, then it wouldn't even be lobbying. So you wouldn't need to be under the exception anyway. Does that answer your question?
It does, but typically you are putting together a publication, at least we are,
Yeah.
that ultimately is going to help us pass some sort of policy.
Sure.
But again, if we're not saying in the publication, state legislators, you should do this because, like, pass this bill because of X, Y, and Z. I just don't understand why it has the potential to fall into lobbying.
Yeah, so the question is, if you're not expressing a view, why would it even potentially fall into lobbying? So again, either in some cases it would express a view, or you're preparing the research publication for the purpose of lobbying legislators. So you're creating this research report knowing that even though in the publication you don't say it, you're going to hand it to a legislator and say, please increase the budget for X by 10%. So in that case, it could be lobbying because it may be considered preparation for lobbying, depending on the purpose for which you're preparing the publication. And there may be multiple purposes. So you may just be doing it for education, and then you decide later that, oh, okay, we want to use it for lobbying also, and then maybe you can allocate costs. But I think generally the exception would matter when either you're preparing it just for the purpose of lobbying, or you actually express a view on legislation in the publication itself. There's another question over here.
Yeah, I'm just curious if ballot measures count for the self-defense. So if there's a
Yeah.
ballot measure that's after your organization or constituency you represent your organization,
Right.
can you not lobby if you're defending it?
So the question is, can self-defense apply to ballot measures? Yes, because self-defense applies to direct lobbying that you do. But again, self-defense is a very narrow exception. So it wouldn't just be, let's say there's a proposal that could eliminate funding for your organization. That would not be considered self-defense to try to oppose that. It would really have to be something that, I know, it's sort of counterintuitive. That would be like the key example of self-defense. But the exception is about proposals that really affect nonprofits generally, the powers and duties of a nonprofit organization. So even if you can make the argument, my nonprofit would be harmed by this, that's not automatically self-defense. It's really about like charitable, deductibility of charitable contributions. Let's say there's a bill there's one in California that said, you know, the nonprofits all have to post links to charity scam resources in the AG's website to alert people of potential fraud. That's something that affects charities more generally. Or the Johnson Amendment, some organizations have said that because that's something about what 501c3s can do, that would be an example of self-defense. Question over here and then over here, I believe. Yes? Glenn from Tucker Madsen School? Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times that litigation wasn't considered
Yeah.
lobbying, but if the litigation is about a specific piece of legislation,
Yeah.
change that?
So the question is, if it's litigation about specific legislation, does that mean that it's lobbying? And the answer is no. So oftentimes litigation will be about legislation that's been passed. It may be, you know, about a statute. So if it is, you know, you're submitting an amicus brief in a court case, then that would not be considered lobbying. So does that answer your question?
Doesn't change anything if you're the plaintiff.
Right, yeah. So it doesn't change anything if you're conducting it primarily or you submit an amicus brief to the court. Question over here?
Edward Knightley, Reach CDC. I learned today that the city also has limits for lobbying. So if one goes beyond the city's limits, are you risking the status of your 501c?
So the question is about the city's limits on lobbying. So I'm not familiar with the city's limits on lobbying, but typically what I've seen is that states and localities say that you are required to disclose your activities once you reach certain thresholds, and they're not specific to different tax statuses of organizations. So I haven't seen city ordinance saying you'll lose your 501c3 status. That's a federal tax designation. Yeah, so Jim from NAO.
So even the charitable affairs section of the Department of Justice of the state doesn't have the ability
Yeah.
to move your 501c3 status. The most that they can do is not allow your organization to provide a charitable benefit status. I mean, unless you break them, unless you commit fraud, or I mean, they can
Yeah.
take other actions against
Right.
you, but they're not getting involved in the lobbying. There is, as was mentioned earlier, the situation with the in Portland and some other cities where you just, if you hit a certain limit, you have to report it to them. It's not that they're coming and checking to see did
Yeah.
you lobby or didn't you. You're registering that we've acted in a certain way, or we have a registered lobbyist with the state, and that person has to provide, you know, a quarterly report
Right.
to the state.
Yeah, so Jim from NAO mentioned that the state doesn't have the ability to take away the federal tax exemption of an organization, and also that there are thresholds that once you cross, you would have to report. So I haven't seen any sort of hard and fast limit saying you can't lobby at the state level once you reach a certain threshold. So I wouldn't characterize it as a limit, but just, you know, once you hit it, you'd have to start reporting. Yeah, question over here.
To that, Natalie with Open Signal.
Natalie with Open Signal.
Portland, City of Portland audit their website, and they have all the specifics about lobbying, and they can tell you like the penalties and other things.
Mm-hmm. And Natalie mentioned that the City of Portland on its website has information about penalties and what reports are required, for example. I should mention we also have state law resources. So if you go to our website, we have some information on state rules. I don't believe we have any local rules publications in Portland, but you know, we can direct you to the right resource. So if you reach out to us, we can get you information on that as well. So just a few points. So 501c3 public charities can and should lobby. Again, there's that whole range of advocacy that you can do that wouldn't be considered lobbying. But you just have to stay within your lobbying limits and make sure that you do have funds that are available to be used for lobbying. Some private foundations may restrict their funds, or government funding, for example. And then most organizations, most 501c3s will benefit from using the expenditure test. It offers more clarity, it doesn't expose your organization to any more risk, and it allows you to clearly understand what is lobbying and what isn't, what is direct lobbying, what is grassroots lobbying. And there will be many activities that you do because you're influencing regulations or department policy that won't even be considered lobbying. And you can contact us for assistance. I do want to take a break now, maybe a 10-minute break. Then we'll come back and talk about civic engagement. But I also want to mention at the end, we do have some case studies that we passed along just to recap. So hopefully that will be helpful in just kind of synthesizing. I know it's a lot of information. We're always here as a resource and happy to clarify, but hopefully the big takeaway is there's a lot more that you can do than maybe you know, nonprofits traditionally think of, and that can be very effective and powerful. So come back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello? Can you? Okay. So hi everyone. So I think for this part, we'll just pass the wireless mic around so it's easier. People can just state their name, their organization, and question that they have. I think that would be easier than me repeating it maybe incorrectly, the question. So I'm going to talk about nonpartisan advocacy. How many organizations are doing any civic engagement or trying to educate people about candidates or elections, any of that? Okay. So again, just want to highlight some different options that are available to 501c3 organizations. And this is a slide that compares different nonprofit organizations. Again, I will send out a copy of these slides. Across the top are just sections of the federal tax code. You have 501c3s, C4, C5s, and C6s. And then there are also 527s, which include PACs and super PACs. So these organizations are also tax exempt, but their sole activity usually is supporting or opposing candidates for public office. So you can have connected 527s. So Sierra Club is a 501c4, and they have a Sierra Club PAC, focuses on electing candidates. And then you can have independent PACs that are like Emily's List is a 527, which focuses on electing women to office. And so that's an independent 527. So this is just to give you an idea. And many organizations have all three. Sierra Club, for example, League of Conservation Voters, they have a 501c4, 501c3, and then also a 527, so they can accomplish different things. So I'm going to focus on the prohibition against supporting or opposing candidates. And there's a lot of misconceptions. We get a lot of questions saying, we're a nonprofit, we can't even talk about this issue because it's a partisan issue. So I want to clear up the misconception. You can still talk about issues, even if they're controversial, but it matters how you talk about them. So there's a difference between saying, you know, we want to protect Medicaid, and we want to protect Medicaid, and we'll remember this in 2018. Or, you know, so there's a clear difference between these two statements. So I want to just highlight, you know, the differences between that. But really, the Johnson Amendment is about not supporting or opposing candidates, and it applies to all 501c3 organizations, including churches and houses of worship. The other point I want to make clear is Just because you work for or volunteer for or are a board member of a 501c3 doesn't mean that you can't support or oppose candidates in your free time. But you want to make sure that you're doing it in your individual capacity, not on behalf of the organization, and that it's clear to the public that you're doing it as an individual. So there's some best practices around that, so I'll go over that. Okay, so what does nonpartisan mean? Again, it does not mean that you can't talk about an issue that tends to be supported by one party or the other. What it specifically means is no support for candidates running for public office. So that also means, as I mentioned before, you can support ballot measures, even though they're on the ballot, because they're not considered partisan activities. It also means you can't support candidates even who are running as independents, not affiliated with political parties. So even quote-unquote nonpartisan offices like a school board or a local sheriff or a local judge, you still couldn't try to get those candidates elected. So nonpartisan doesn't just mean you can't support someone who's affiliated with a political party. It also means that your organization can't support or oppose political parties because they're seen as supporting a group of candidates. They're associated with a group of candidates. So who's a candidate? Well, it includes people that have declared for office, officially declared, but it also includes efforts to try to draft someone to run or encourage someone to run. So your organization still couldn't say, you know, dump so-and-so or we want so-and-so to run and like put out ads saying we encourage Elizabeth Warren, for example, to run for president. Because even though she hasn't declared, you still can't support prospective candidates. And it's any public office, mayor, school board. I mentioned trying to influence a school board decision is not lobbying, but a 501c3 still could not support or oppose a candidate for a school board. Also, board of supervisors, sheriff. There's a question here, and can we get the mic to, yeah. I think for the recording, they wanted to have people on the mic. Thank you.
So I'm Ingrid with Adelante Mujeres. With social media, you're saying that you can speak about these things and support and endorse candidates by your individual self, as long as you don't, bring in your organization. But sometimes on social media, people have like a board of blah 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 or something like that. So do you recommend that you just take all that off if you're going to be putting anything on social media to endorse a certain?
Yeah, so I'll get to social media, but generally speaking, the question is it a personal account or is it an organizational account? And that will depend on the context. At AFJ, I know we just have two separate accounts. I have a organizational Twitter and a personal Twitter, and then I just tweet about, candidates in my free time on my personal account. And then on my organizational account, it's very clear. It has the name of the organization. It says, I work for this organization. And then on my personal account, I say my views are my own. I have disclaimers like that. So the question is, looking at the account, is it an organizational or is it a personal account? And if the line gets blurry, then you may want to consider just having a separate account. Same goes for Facebook, I would say. Yes, another question over here.
Natalie with Open Signal. I had a question about, you said that candidate forums, organizations can host candidate forums, but so there cannot be a situation where you just invite one candidate to speak. You must invite all candidates. What is the threshold?
Yeah, so I will get to candidate forums specifically. Okay. Generally speaking, if you are inviting someone because they're a candidate, then you will need to invite all viable candidates. But if they're not there because they're a candidate, let's say they sit on an important committee and you're inviting them because they're an expert on a topic, then you're not required in that circumstance to invite all candidates. But it does get risky the closer in time you get to an election, because even if you're inviting them because they wrote a book or you give them an award for their leadership, if it's a week before the election, it may be risky just in terms of the optics of the event. But generally, the first question is, are they there because they're a candidate or not? Yeah, so I'll get to this. Viability, what the IRS has said in terms of viability is that there should be some sort of neutral or objective criteria used to determine who's viable. So it shouldn't be criteria that's designed to exclude a particular candidate. Maybe well before the event, an organization could determine that they're going to invite candidates above a certain polling threshold, for example. It should be some sort of neutral, objective criteria. So, okay, so it's very clear when a 501c3 says, we endorse this candidate. But sometimes there's issue advocacy, and the IRS wants to know that your issue advocacy is not geared towards influencing the outcome of an election. So what they've said is they want to look at all the facts and circumstances, essentially the context, to try to determine, is the point of you releasing this communication or doing this activity to try to influence an election, or are you really trying to talk about an issue? So I want to go through some specific examples because it really depends on the facts. So let's say you're an organization called Oregonians for Kids, and you put out an ad like this, let's say in election year and outside of election year, and you have a track record of talking about children's health issues. Let's say you're not showing any candidates, you're not referring to any candidates here, the pictures are just generic stock images. And let's say that you release this particular ad, let's say a year before any election takes place. So from these facts, do you think it's low risk, medium risk, or high risk that it would be considered supporting or opposing a candidate for public office, or that it would be seen as a partisan ad communication? Yeah, it's probably low because, again, you're not referring to candidates. It's not close in time to an election. You have a track record of talking about an issue, so you can make the case that, look, we have a reason for weighing in that's related to this is important to our mission. It also helps if it's tied to a non-electoral event. Let's say there's a hearing on a children's health chip reauthorization, for example. Then that can help you argue that it's really about this hearing or this legislative proposal. It's not about an election at all. But let's say hypothetically this was released after a debate where one candidate says, this election is about jobs, and if my opponent thinks this is about kids, they're just kidding around. And let's say that this organization never puts out these kinds of ads. They're primarily a research organization, and they decide to release this maybe a couple weeks before an election. So from these facts, do you all think it would be high risk, medium risk, or low risk? So there's some medium, there's some high, and so there's room for disagreement. I would probably say this is a high risk communication, and the reason is because of the timing, because they're referring to a statement that was made by one of the candidates about who's just kidding around. In the previous election, references to we want to build bridges, not walls, is clearly referencing one of the candidates over the other. Also, it matters, the track record of the organization. They've just been doing research. They never put out these kind of ads, and it looks suspicious why they're putting out an ad right before an election. So those are some of the factors to take into account. Again, we're not saying if it's risky or you shouldn't do it, or if it's less risky, you automatically should, but it's just something to keep in mind. Do you really have a good reason for talking about it that's related to your mission and promoting this issue rather than trying to influence the election or try to get a certain candidate elected? So these are some of the factors to think about. Are you referring to candidates at all? Are you timing it close to an election? Is it a wedge issue? So that's something to consider. Is it something that clearly divides the candidates? Then maybe talking about the issue gets riskier as the election gets closer, because even though you're not referring to a candidate, to the public it may seem like you're clearly trying to, or it may seem to the public that you're trying to support one candidate by talking about this issue. There's a question over here. Can we get the mic over here? Thank you.
So you mentioned mission, Tony from Verde. You mentioned mission.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? And do you have to adhere? I mean, how closely do you adhere in terms of relating to mission?
I do think that your advocacy work should further your mission in some way, whether or not it's core to your mission, but it advances your mission. It's helpful if you do have a record of talking about this issue so that you can claim that it's important to your organization to speak out, that you have a history of legislative advocacy or administrative advocacy or speaking up. Just to give a concrete example, the ACLU, which is a 501c4, during the campaign, they talked about the proposed travel ban, and they have a history of working on issues related to immigration and refugees. And they made a statement that this is a discriminatory ban. that we urge all political leaders to reject this proposal and dangerous rhetoric. So they were able to make a statement that was about the issue involved, about the specific proposal, without talking about candidates, not even talking about the election, and telling everyone that they should reject this proposal. So there are ways to talk about your issues, especially that are important to your organization, without really, without even having to talk about candidates in the race. But I'll go through some specific examples. So how would you do, and these are some buckets of activities that you all can do during elections: issue advocacy, candidate education, voter engagement. So what about issue advocacy? You can continue your lobbying or advocacy campaigns. You can just have to make sure to track and report it, but it is permitted activity. And public charities can support or oppose ballot measures, but because you have to be nonpartisan, 501c3s can't align with parties or coordinate strategy with candidates when they're trying to support or oppose ballot measures. So let's say you want to criticize an incumbent, sitting elected official. This is an example of a group that says, child advocates oppose Ryan budget blueprint. And I know it's small, but it says, House Budget Chair proposes deep cuts to healthcare and income supports. Voices for America's Children, the nation's largest network of multi-issue child advocacy organizations, raised concern over House Budget Committee Chair Paul Ryan's proposed budget. So they're referring to him in his capacity as speaker, not as a candidate. They're talking about the issue, the budget. They're not criticizing his personal characteristics or saying he's unfit for office. They're not even talking about voting or the election. So this would be an example of a communication that's really issue focused. And this would be a best practice for an organization, especially in an election year, to make clear that they care about this issue and that's why they're weighing in. Also, it's beneficial if they release this statement right after the budget has been proposed, then they can make the case that we're really responding because it's been released. And then also I would say that it's important to be able to point to a track record of working on a particular issue. The same thing goes for praising incumbents. So California Immigrant Policy Center, 501c3, they put out a statement praising Governor Brown in California, Governor Brown, for continuing to propel California forward with pro-immigrant policies, investing in immigrant communities in the budget. Again, they're not referring to him as a candidate. They're not talking about the election at all. They're talking about the issues involved. So these are some guidelines. Yes?
But was that right?
Oh, sorry, 1 second. Thank you for running around.
Leah CV with Oasis Shelter Home. Was that right before an election?
So in this particular case, it wasn't, but I do think that's a factor, right? If it's right before an election, then it's riskier. If the budget maybe was released right before an election, maybe there's a better argument that that was when you had to put out this statement. So that is a factor to consider, is the timing of the communication.
Okay. Could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, yeah.
So I wrote a letter to the editor at our local newspaper applauding our district attorney for the great work that he did on some cases. Mm-hmm. And then about 6 months later, I wrote another letter, very similar, but it was like a month before his election. Mm-hmm. So should I have not written that second one?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that the timing is one factor, but I would say it does help that you have a history or you've written a letter thanking the Attorney General before. Depends what the wording is. If you're focused on the issues, you're not really referencing voting or
I didn't say
the Attorney
anything
General's
about
candidacy or the election. Mm-hmm. So as a whole, the timing is one factor, and you'd have to look at the other factors to try to determine, should I talk about this at this time? Yeah. Was there another question over here? Thanks. Yeah.
Edward Knightley, Reach CDC. If one of your board members wants to personally support a candidate, should they do something to separate their choice from the organization?
Definitely. So I'll repeat the question was about if a board member wants to support a candidate, what should they do to ensure it's not on behalf of the 501c3? There are a number of best practices. One is if you're going to an event, don't hand out your business cards, wear your organizational t-shirt to give the impression that you're there on behalf of the organization. Of course, board member or staff or volunteer should do it on their own time, not staff time. They should not use any charity resources, office phone, office facilities, office computer, for example. And also, if they do need to identify themselves in any kind of publication, for example, then it should be clear that the organization name is just for identification purposes only. So sometimes you'll see, members of churches, leaders of churches, for example, saying that, oh, they're a minister at a church. But they will say, there'll be an asterisk that says disclaimer, or this is for identification purposes only. So there are a number of steps you can take. The best thing is just try to create as much separation as possible. Make clear to the people there, to the public, that it's in your individual capacity. Question over here.
Glenn from Tucker Maxson School. I just want to make a comment about optics you can't control, which is what the media says.
Yeah.
So I got up once at an event and said, I'm not speaking on behalf of my organization. Within 5 minutes, live tweet, or whatever, live, something went out that basically said my name, my position, my organization. It never said I wasn't speaking for my organization. When I got up and said specifically I wasn't speaking. So the fact is that the optics are that you are an employee, and the higher up the chain of leadership you are, the more likely you are to be basically tagged with that. And then after it is out in the media, there's almost nothing you can do about it. So my cautionary tale is be careful.
Great. Yeah, I definitely agree. In the case of the media, your organization could try to ask the media to retract that identification. There are a number of steps you can take, but again, there is a risk of the media, even if you make a disclaimer saying that you're there on behalf of the organization. So there are a number of, so this is responding to candidates I mentioned earlier. It says, barring a group of people from entering our country based solely on their faith is unlawful and un-American. We're a nation of immigrants. We urge all political leaders to categorically reject this dangerous escalation of rhetoric. And so again, it's not referring to the election, it's talking about the proposal. And it is a criticism of something that a candidate has said. But ACLU has a history of talking about this issue, and they do focus on the issues involved, not about fitness for office or personal characteristics or anything like that. So how many groups are doing legislative scorecards by any chance? Like just letting people know how legislators have voted. So this is an option available to you as a 501c3. So your organization, some guidelines, some best practices, including all legislators in a particular jurisdiction. So if it's a city council legislative scorecard to all city council members. And you should avoid commentary if it's distributed to the general public. So resisting comparing the views of the legislator to your organization's views, just providing information. So-and-so voted yes on this bill, voted no on this bill. It's really meant to be an educational service for members of your community, people that you work with. But this is something that C3s can do. Did you want to? Okay, come in. Yeah. Sure. Time out. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's not broadcast this part. So there's pizzas and salad. The salad is communal, so and I believe there's gluten-free option there as well. So if you want, we've got everything set up out there. Just kind of file out there, get on both sides, grab lunch, and bring it back in here, Sean, continue. Okay? And everybody gets to see you eating all over Oregon.
Scorecard. And this was put out by the organization Human Rights Campaign. And this is where the Democratic candidates stand, then Democratic candidates, an analysis of candidate questionnaires on issues of concern to the LGBT community. So for example, at that time, federal recognition of state-level same-sex unions, Employment Non-Discrimination Act, hate crimes, and then it says where then Senator Clinton, or Secretary Clinton, I think Senator Clinton at that time, and then Senator Obama, where they stand on these issues. So do you all think that a 501c3 could put out an analysis of candidate questionnaires like this? So actually, the one I was talking about before was a legislative scorecard. There are ways to do candidate questionnaires, but this would be risky for a 501c3. And the reason is because you're not just providing information based on the candidate's responses to the public in a nonpartisan, objective way. You're really analyzing the candidate's votes and expressing to people whether or not it is positive or negative. So this would be more risky for a 501c3 to do, a candidate scorecard, and Human Rights Campaign is a 501c4 organization. But there are ways to do candidate questionnaires and voter guides in a C3-friendly way. There are ways to do that. So I'll go over that, but the next bucket of activities is candidate education. Do any groups here reach out to candidates, educate them about their issues, meet with them, say this is important? Okay. So this is something that's completely C3 permissible. It's best to offer your materials to all candidates in a race. Even if you think they'll ignore it, even if you think they will disagree with it, it's still best to offer it to them. And it's also important to use what you've already gathered. So you wouldn't want to create new material because they asked you to develop talking points or develop new material at their request. And if you're creating new information, there should be a good organizational reason for doing it. But if someone asks you, like a candidate comes to you and says, we want this material, your report that you've done on poverty, for example, or public transit, then you can provide that to them just like you would any other individual in the community, like a student or a journalist, for example. But if you are proactively offering materials, it's best to offer it to all candidates in a race. So what about voter education? I mentioned that 501c3s can do candidate questionnaires. There's some best practices, though, to ensure that it won't be seen as partisan. First is to have unbiased questions. So this would be an example of, you're asking for a yes or no answer, and it's best to ask open-ended questions. So not, do you support comprehensive immigration reform, but what would you do to address issues of concern to undocumented immigrants, for example? That's a broad open-ended question. Or what would you do to improve air quality in Oregon? Or what would you do to raise Oregon's ranking in education? Those are all open-ended questions. It should be distributed to all candidates in a race and touch on a broad range of issues. And then also it's important not to have pledges, because the IRS views pledges as indicating support for a candidate if they take the pledge in opposition to those who don't take the pledge. And then if the way you're formatting the voter guide, if you look at this corner, it's approximately the same length, their answers. It's not formatted in a way that looks like one answer is, given more emphasis than in another. The font size, the style is all the same. One thing I also want to mention, that Jim asked me to mention is that when you're thinking about partisan and nonpartisan, that oftentimes, you do want to make sure that your activities are nonpartisan. But it's also important to realize that how this may come up is, maybe someone raises it. We're not aware that the IRS is doing a lot of robust enforcement of this particular provision of 501c3 organizations. Of course, you should be, make sure that all your activities are nonpartisan. But I think that we don't want you to feel like you can't do anything around elections. And so that I don't want that to be the takeaway today, that if it's around elections, we can't do anything at all. Another thing to mention is that you may have heard about, there was an executive order about the Johnson Amendment. Maybe you all have heard about that. And the executive order, just to clarify, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what it did, but it essentially could weaken the enforcement of the Johnson Amendment as it relates to religious organizations and houses of worship. So again, the executive order does not and cannot repeal the Johnson Amendment. It doesn't allow churches to now endorse candidates, but it does make it a little more difficult for the IRS to look into situations where a church may have acted in a partisan way. So that's just to clarify what that executive order did. So yeah, in case there were any misconceptions about that. A disclaimer can always help in your voter guide saying your organization doesn't support or oppose candidates, doesn't take a stance on the candidates, you're a 501c3. That's helpful to just indicate to the public, this is provided as an educational service, not because we're trying to influence the election. And there's a question earlier about candidate forums. So this is something your 501c3 can do. I'm curious if any groups are already doing this, candidate forums. Okay, so a couple. With candidate forums, it's also best to have a broad range of questions, an unbiased moderator. Groups invite a radio host or a journalist. Although, it seems like journalists these days have become maybe not nonpartisan. So I don't know, but someone in the community that's respected, trusted by both sides of the aisle. Unbiased audience is also important. So you could distribute the same amount of tickets to each candidate so that you're not just having an audience that is overly hostile or favorable to one candidate. You could reach out to the broad cross-section of the community. Those are some steps that you can take. And then you want to give an equal opportunity to for people to speak. You want to invite all viable candidates, again, using some kind of objective criteria. And then, again, open-ended questions, allowing them to respond. So if you see a lot of, universities have like candidate debates, a lot of the rules that they abide by are because they're 501c3s. So they try to make it as nonpartisan. They say, another rule is like, don't clap so that the audience isn't biased towards one candidate, hold your responses. So there are a number of things that you can do. So let's say you invite someone not because they're a candidate, but because for some other reason. Let's say they're an expert on an issue, you want them to sit on a panel, you want to give them an award, maybe they wrote a book on a topic, you want to ask them to talk about it. It does get risky closer in time to an election, but you can invite them without inviting other candidates. But you want to make sure that there's no fundraising occurring at the event, that the public knows that it's not a partisan event, that you're working with the officials' incumbent staff rather than their campaign staff. So if it's a senator, working with the Senate staff, not communicating with the campaign staff, and especially making sure that the elected official knows that it's not a candidate event, so they don't make a remark about their candidacy. So you can take some steps to make clear to everyone that it's not a campaign event, but this is something you can do, and you're not required to invite all candidates if it is not a candidate event. Yes? Yeah. Right here.
Jim at NAO. So is there a time when a candidate is not a candidate? And what I mean by that is this, that in Oregon, we have a citizen legislature. So they are part-time. They're not full employees as they are in some other states. So they have day jobs. If a person announces their candidacy, does any contact with them from then on count as contact with a candidate, or how does that work? Because they may be lawyers and doctors and other, they're citizens.
So the question is not, the question is not, when they officially declare. The first question is, why are you inviting them? For what reason? Is it because they're a candidate, in which case, you should invite all viable candidates in the race if it's a candidate forum, give an equal opportunity to participate. I would just say if they are a candidate and you're not inviting them because they're a candidate, you're inviting them for some other reason, I think the important thing is, first of all, making sure the public knows it's not partisan, but then also the timing of the event matters a lot. It gets riskier, I'd say, the closer in time it is to an election. Because even if you want to say it's not a candidate event and it's a week before the election, it starts to get, I think, riskier to engage with candidates, especially closer to the election, if you're inviting them to come speak. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. And then there's voter engagement activities that 501c3s can do. How many groups are doing voter registration or get out the vote? Okay, a few. How many want to do more, maybe considering it? Okay. Maybe more after this, but yeah. So voter registration, something that's, tried and true activity of 501c3s. It should be nonpartisan, and that means that You shouldn't refer to a party or candidate, shouldn't suggest who to vote for, which party to register with. If you're working with another organization, you want to make sure that those joint activities are also nonpartisan. So let's say it's a union or a 501c4. You want to make sure that those activities are nonpartisan because you couldn't do anything in a coalition that you wouldn't be able to do yourselves as a C3. And then the service should be available to everyone, even if you don't like the party that they're going to register with or they have a sticker that you don't like. You have to make it available to everyone. Can't turn away people based on, based on their likely party affiliation. And then if you're focusing on certain neighborhoods, you're permitted to do that. But you should have a nonpartisan reason for doing it. Not because you're focusing on people that are registered with a certain party, you're focusing on turning them out, or you're focusing on a swing district. Those would be examples of partisan criteria. But if you use nonpartisan criteria, you can focus in certain areas. Let's say you have other programs in a certain neighborhood. That's the reason why you chose it. You should have a documentation of that. This is why we're choosing these neighborhoods. You can choose areas where people are underrepresented at the polls. So for example, low-income people, youth are traditionally underrepresented at the polls. So 501c3s may go on a college campus because they say youth don't participate. It's important to have documentation of why you're choosing areas, not because they're more likely to vote for a certain party. So those are some kind of best practices for 501c3s. Okay, so it's also important when you're doing voter registration, there are certain issues when you connect it to voting that could be risky and could be seen as partisan. So I'm curious if people think the phrase vote pro-choice would be considered partisan. Yeah, so the IRS has said there are certain code words that are so associated with political parties that it would be partisan to link them to voting. But if you're just doing issue advocacy, you could still do that. It gets risky when you're tying it to voting. So other phrases they've said are vote pro-life, vote pro-choice, vote conservative, vote liberal. These are all examples of sort of code words. What about vote the environment? What do people think? People think this would be partisan? I would say it depends. It depends on the race. So in a particular race, it may be a very divisive issue. It may be clear who you're referring to. But in another case, maybe it's not a real distinguishing issue between the candidates, and maybe there's a ballot measure on environmental issues, and that's why you're talking about it. So it really depends on the context, I would say. There's some issues, maybe if one candidate is really for public lands, and you say, vote for the candidate who protects public lands, it may be clear who you're referring to in that circumstance. So it really depends. Obviously, the safest thing is vote. It's easy. It's not the most persuasive thing, but that is like the safest. You could say vote, it's your civic duty, it's important to the future of the country, it's important to the economy, education, the environment, etc. Okay, so what about social media? There was a question earlier. Your website and your social media accounts also shouldn't be partisan. If you are, there's not a lot of guidance by the IRS, but there's a difference, I think, between following a candidate and liking a candidate's Facebook page. Arguably, that could be seen as supporting a candidate. So you want to be mindful of what your social media is doing and also what you're linking to on your websites. So your 501c3 website should not link to posts or websites that support particular candidates, and you should review your links to be mindful of that. So on Facebook, we get questions about, well, what about on our Facebook page, people write comments? How do we deal with comments? So there are a number of different options that you have. You could have a disclaimer saying the comments are not the comments of the organization and don't represent the views of the organization. You could have a practice where you delete any partisan comment and you let people know we'll delete anything related to candidates. Of course, that requires you to be very diligent that you're doing it in a fair way, in a nonpartisan way. But a disclaimer can help, just saying, people may make comments, but they're not the organization's views necessarily. Of course, you want to remind your staff and volunteers, and we have sample policies on our website, so to let people know, don't use resources to do partisan activity. If you're doing candidate work, do it on your own time, don't use our resources. So this is an example of a Twitter account from someone who used to work at Alliance for Justice. And I'm curious if you think this would be a personal or organizational account, and I'll read some of the information. So it says, Darren CA, lawyer and activist, work at the Sierra Club, tweets are my own. And then he talks about eviction, and then, so these are some of the factors. I mean, do people think maybe this is personal, organizational? What are some of the factors you would look at? I know it's hard to see. So yeah, there's some factors that indicate it's personal. It says tweets are mine. It says, it doesn't have his organization's name in the handle, in the Twitter handle. It also matters what he's tweeting about. So if he's only tweeting about work, then it's, maybe there's an argument that it's actually an organizational account. So I think it depends on the whole context of the Twitter account. But if you want to be safest, again, you could have just 2 Twitter accounts and be completely safe that, your personal account is separate from your organizational account and not tweet from that account on work time. And then the rules that apply to staff and volunteers are when they're acting on behalf of the 501c3, as I mentioned. So some best practices for staff and volunteers, again, not doing partisan work on work time. If the organization is giving leave to people, maybe to do canvassing, they should do so based on their, following their personnel policies. So they shouldn't give special treatment to people depending on what political activities they're doing. If they would normally give time off to this person because they've worked at the organization for a certain number of years, or they've accrued a certain number of days off, then you're allowed to give paid time off, but you don't want to do it in a preferential way. So basically, the organization doesn't want to treat people differently if they know that they're going to be doing political work off work hours. It doesn't want to look like the organization is supporting any of their individual partisan activities. So best practices, not using the resources, staff time, email, copier. Another thing is email. We actually got a question where someone was running for office and they accidentally sent their campaign email from their work account, from their 501c3 email. So making sure that if you're using the mail app, you know which email you're sending it from, not doing it on work time. Those are some of the best practices. And again, I think some of this is important because if someone even raises a question, you can quickly respond and say, look, we have all these procedures in place. We've taken all these steps. We're making clear we're following it. And you can respond quickly and it doesn't become a distraction. There's a question over here.
This is a quick and simple question. Laura Handy from Heart of Oregon Corps. What about staff or participants, clients, wearing political T-shirts, hats, buttons when someone's running for office in the workplace?
Yeah, so again, there's the safest approach is not to do that while you're working at a 501c3. Practically speaking, there's increased risk when you're interacting with members of the public and wearing that T-shirt, because that's how people may complain or come to know about it and say, hey, it looks like they're doing canvassing work or they're doing campaign work for this person. So that's how practically there would be more risk to the organization. But if you're asking for the best practice, I would say not to have that, try to avoid that while you're at work. Yes. Sorry.
Jim and NAO. So do candidates or do sitting legislators have any requirements on their side, any restrictions around them contacting us as 501c3s? Because I know I've wound up on candidates, will you give me money on my nonprofitoregon.org. So they could have only gotten it based on interactions I had relative to advocacy issues.
Right.
So they start campaigning to us. Do they have any restrictions?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what restrictions apply to candidates. I think as far as emails go, a best practice when you get an email about a campaign is maybe just to say, we're a 501, just respond saying we're a 501c3, we don't support or oppose candidates, just let them know that. It's up to them to find your personal email information. I think that would be the kind of safest approach for 501c3s to handle information. You know, sometimes I'll get requests, hey, do you know anything about this campaign? Do you know anything about that campaign? I think in that circumstance, the safest approach would just be, you know, either providing information on all the candidates running, just a neutral website that has information about who's running, or just saying, you know, we don't have that information, you know, please, you know, our organization doesn't support candidates or something like that, yeah. But I don't, to answer your question, I don't know what rules exist for candidates, state level candidates.
And then maybe as a follow-up, would you advise for or against an answer to that being, this is my 501c3 account, please don't contact me here. But here is my regular email. I mean, if you're sending it from your account, or do you just have to say, I'm not interested, or it's up to you to find my private account?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question. I don't have a clear answer on it. I think it is riskier to try to direct them to a personal account. You know, will someone say, hey, you're using your work email to try to funnel a campaign message to a personal account? It's hard to give a definitive answer. I think, again, the safest approach would just be to say that we don't support candidates. Yeah, and then, you know, on your own time, maybe you could contact them, you know, and get in touch with them that way. Yeah, there's a question here.
I haven't answered that question. Used to work for many electeds, and we would get asks for endorsements, but I would be a staffer, and oftentimes we'd either call that person or you write back with that specific information saying that, you know, you can't be contacting them for endorsement, or this is, you know, we couldn't be affiliated just like a nonprofit with spending any time towards that. But otherwise, you know, if it's best to call, like if they're trying to schedule to get a meeting, schedulers are in this like weird funky territory where they still have to take over the calendar. So it's possible if that's of interest, but I always do stuff on the phone when it comes to that.
Question or comment here?
Glenn Gilbert, Tucker Maxson School. Many of us have volunteers, and sometimes we give them a domain email from our nonprofit, and you've made me think that sometimes that might not be a great idea because we don't have as much control over what they say and do. So do you have a recommendation about volunteers having emails?
Yeah, the rules do apply to volunteers acting on behalf of the organization. So they should be aware that when they're doing something on behalf of the 501c3, it shouldn't be partisan. So staff should be informed about that, and volunteers. There's a question in the back, I think. Yeah.
Kate with Beneficial State Foundation, and just curious in your advice, we're all human. Let's say you end up in a situation where you do get a complaint or someone's trying to raise attention to a mistake outside these guidelines that was made by an employee or a volunteer. What's the tone and message? What do you say? Do you apologize? Do you try to just minimize it? What's language or messaging or best practices?
I think you want to explain how you've tried to remedy the mistake. We have a policy. Maybe you could say, we have a policy. We've let staff know. What steps have you taken to try to stay in compliance with the laws? You know, staff sent this by mistake, but we've reminded them. We did a staff training. We asked them to review this policy. They assured us that it was a technology glitch. We fixed the technology glitch. You know, what have you done to kind of remedy it? I would say definitely it's not best to just ignore it and just say, oh, well, we just ignore it. It was a mistake. You have to make sure it's clear to people that it was a mistake and that you did something about it. Any other questions? One question here, yeah.
I'm Kathy with Treasure Valley Children's Relief Nursery. I kind of wanted to piggyback on what Jim had said, like when is a candidate not a candidate? I'm from a very small town.
Yeah.
And so when someone was running for an office, I know them I've known them a very long time personally, and so I wrote a letter to the editor saying, you know, I would hardly endorse this person. They were on my board for a long time, but I know them from church and lovely family and all this. So maybe I shouldn't have done that. I'm very conscientious about never doing anything from my work email and, telling staff never to wear. It's in our handbook. Don't wear political things. If you have a bumper sticker on your car, I can't help that. It's in our parking lot for a short time. But perhaps I wasn't very conscientious with that. But it is a small town. I do know him personally. I don't know.
I mean, you can still endorse in your individual capacity.
But they were a board member of mine, and most people probably linked that I knew him that way. He was a board member for 9 years.
So yeah, I don't think you're responsible. It's not 501c3 support just because you knew the person through your work. I think it matters, what resources you're using to make the endorsement to try to help them get elected. What resources are you using? Are you using the goodwill or the name of the organization to try to get the person elected? I think those are the considerations to make.
No, but I'm sure somebody could think that now that I'm thinking about it.
So I think there's a difference between someone connecting it and you're making the case that, like our 501c3 is going to help with printing out flyers. Like what you're actually doing versus what people perceive is different. You're responsible for what you do, what your organization does. Any other questions? Okay. So just a few other points. Again, hopefully there's a lot of information I know, but just the broad level points. C3s can continue to advocate even during election year. Engage in communities talking about issues important to your community. It may be lobbying, in which case, you just need to track and report it, but it's something that you can do. 501c3s can educate voters about candidates as long as it's done in a nonpartisan way. They can register voters. They can get out the vote. And then you can, in your personal time, get involved in partisan politics. And we do get a lot of questions, well, when is it my individual time? When is it my work time? Again, I think the question to ask is, if someone complains about it, if someone raises a question, what can you point to? What steps have you taken to try to distance your partisan activity from the organization's activities? And the more that you can point to, hey, I did it off my work time, I didn't use resources, I think in the better position you're in. And then we can help with specific questions. We have some sample policies online. We have some in-depth publications, especially related to your social media activities, other digital activities, other election-related activities that you all can do. And again, you can email us at advocacy@afj.org. I will send out the slides. You will have access to the slides if you do want to sign in, or I can get your email in another way and we'll send that over. So at this time, I know we have about 30 minutes. In your packet, there should be a page called Case Studies. You all should have that. It's just some concrete scenarios. I know sometimes this gets a little abstract. So just to think through different kind of advocacy activities and just going through them, if you could just discuss in your groups the answers to the questions, and then we'll come back and talk about it, and hopefully this kind of makes it more concrete. Does everyone have that, or does anyone need that?
Does anybody need a packet?
And maybe we'll take like 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll just come back and talk about it. Hopefully these are made-up organizations. I just picked random names. Hopefully they're not real organizations. They're not meant to be. So Oregonians for Justice is supporting immigrant and refugee communities, and they have made the 501H election. So they submitted the one-page form, and that's how they calculate lobbying. And they want to reform policing in Portland, and they send out tweets and Facebook posts, and they tell City of Portland residents to contact city council members to urge them to oppose the new nominee for chief of police. So the first question is, and also the city council is voting to confirm it, confirm this person. Is that generally the case in Portland? I know that's the case in Los Angeles, but I just want to make sure it's the case here also. Yeah. Okay. So the first question is this prohibited support or opposition for a candidate for public office? How many people think yes? No? So it's actually no, because in this example, the city council is voting to confirm this nominee. It's not someone who's running for office and the voters are voting for this or not voting for this person. Yes. Can we get a mic over here? Thanks.
Didn't you use an example previously about the president nominating a Supreme Court justice and that you had to stay away from that? So what's the distinction?
So that is an example of lobbying when you tell a senator to vote for a Supreme Court justice. That would be an example of lobbying, which is permitted, but it's not considered support or opposition for a candidate. So that example was when I was talking about what is considered legislation. So the next question is, are these social media communications, are they considered lobbying? And do people think it's direct or grassroots? How many direct? Grassroots? Yeah, so in this example, the Facebook posts or tweets are not directed at a legislator. So it would be direct lobbying if you said, at city council member, please vote no. That would be an example of direct lobbying. But in this example, it's to the public. So you're asking the public to contact their legislators. So it'd be grassroots lobbying under 501H. Some of the people are volunteers who do this. Would you need to count and report the volunteers' activities to the IRS? What do people think? So there's some split disagreement. So why would you say yes? And I can repeat it, so it's easier. Yeah, so the question is, are they representing the organization? Let's say they are. Let's say they are representing the organization. So even though they're representing the organization, remember under 501H, it's an expenditure test. You're only counting what the organization spends on lobbying. So unless you have, so because the volunteers, assuming they're not paid volunteers, so they're not paid, so you wouldn't need to count any costs other than, let's say you're providing meals to them while they're doing this, or you're providing, let's say you're reimbursing travel expenses because they're going to city council. You need to count those costs, but you're not required to report volunteer activities to the IRS under this 501H test. So it's actually another benefit of 501H is if you have a lot of volunteers, you don't need to report their activities because the organization's not incurring an expense when they're doing work. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Yeah, does social media have an expense to it? Does your list
Yeah.
have an expense? Outside of the staff members' time to push out
Sure.
the materials, is there an expense associated with that you
Yeah,
need to be?
so the question is about social media costs. There are 3 types of costs that you need to track. First is staff time. The second is direct costs. And with social media, there likely wouldn't be any direct costs. Direct costs are like printing out flyers, travel expenses. And then you do have to calculate a portion of your overhead, and you can get the portion of overhead based on the percentage of staff time spent on lobbying. So if it's 3% staff time spent on lobbying, you can say 3% of overhead should be counted. So you do need to count a portion of overhead costs.
Based on your admin, indirect on your 990 from the previous year?
Your overhead costs?
Yeah, where are you going to have to get that?
You have to estimate what your overhead costs are for the year. Yeah, it could be based on last year, your projection for the coming year. The other thing I'll note about overhead is, in some cases, an organization may buy some new software specifically for a legislative campaign, and then your organization may need to count the cost of that if it's, it's this new like Salsa, we use Salsa Blast or Salesforce, something like that. Okay, great. So we'll go on to the second one. Any questions about this scenario? On the cost, yeah.
There's a whole sequence of costs. There's a whole sequence of costs when you're engaging a volunteer. There's recruitment,
Yeah.
training,
Yes.
Educating, even just generally, irrespective of the policy in question. And then there's like walking in to meet with a legislator, which is like the final like mini cost of the larger thing. How does a nonprofit calculate what amount of the life cycle you account for in a lobbying expense?
Sure. So you need to count the training that's for the purpose of lobbying, specifically for the purpose of lobbying. And if there are multiple purposes, let's say you're training volunteers on how to do registration, voter registration, also how to lobby on this bill, then you're permitted to allocate costs and say, let's say half the training was about voter registration. You can say half the staff time was spent on non-lobbying, and then half the time was spent on lobbying. So it matters the purpose for the training of the volunteers. You don't have to count all the training of volunteers. Again, the training for the purpose of lobbying. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions about this scenario? Great. So Oregonians for Kids, again, I just made this up. Public charity prepares a report studying the effect of current Oregon health plan spending on health outcomes in the state of Oregon. Oregon Health Plan, that's your state Medicaid program, right? Okay. So the report includes data on Oregon Health Plan spending over time, analyzes various measures of health, and compares Oregon data to Medicaid data in other states. It also includes a recommendation saying the health plan budget should be increased by 25%, and it's distributed to legislators on both sides of the aisle. Is this lobbying? No. So there's some disagreement. You know, so I think we need some more information here, but it could be nonpartisan analysis. Is it a full and fair discussion of the issue? It looks like it has a lot of data. It looks like it's doing a lot of analysis. So it could be nonpartisan analysis. That's the second question. But if it wasn't that, if it didn't meet the criteria, if it wasn't a full and fair discussion, then it would be lobbying because you're clearly expressing a view to specific legislators about the budget, which is a legislative item. And then another key component of nonpartisan analysis is that it should be widely distributed. And in this example, it is distributed to people on both sides of the aisle, not just people that you think will agree with the recommendation. What about the staff time spent doing the research and preparing the report? Would that be considered lobbying? Oh, there's a question here about that. Yeah. Yeah. So
the question was,
yeah.
how do you legitimize full and fair research? Do you cite nonpartisan foundations or research? I mean, do you have any recommendations?
So practically how to make it full and fair, I think one is definitely using data, citing studies. I think looking at both sides of the issue is very important. You can't just look at one side of the issue. And you can't kind of just mention the other argument without really fleshing it out. Just say, other people say this, but blah, blah, blah. And then not giving it short shrift, basically. So you want to really take the time to respond and take seriously the arguments made by the other side, even if you come out in one way. So let's say, would the time spent doing the research and preparing the report be considered a lobbying expense? What do you think? Yeah, it depends if it's lobbying or not. Yeah. So if it's nonpartisan analysis, then the time spent preparing the report would not be lobbying. So the last question is, let's say you distribute it to the public, not to the legislators at all, and it doesn't have a call to action. So you say the same thing. You say, we want the healthcare budget to be increased by 25%, the Oregon Health Plan budget, but you don't say anything about contacting legislators, and it doesn't have a call to action. Is this lobbying? Yeah, it's not. So it's just advocacy. Again, in this example, the organization, let's see. So let's say hypothetically, this organization has made the 501H election. So they need a call to action when they distribute it to the public for it to be considered lobbying. So it would not be lobbying. So scenario 3 now. Ban Fracking Now, again, hypothetical, is a 501c3 public charity that has made the 501H election. A coalition of environmental leaders from across the state asks the organization to sign on to a letter to the Oregon legislature urging a law that bans fracking in the state. Is this lobbying? And is this direct or grassroots lobbying? It's direct, yeah. So the way to think about it is, if you're being asked to sign on, then you're essentially expressing a view to the legislators, going to a legislator, and it's on specific legislation. Ban fracking now, I would say, is sufficiently specific. It's just a complete ban, a total and complete ban. So let's say your organization, Ban Fracking Now, was instead the one that was circulating the letter to environmental leaders asking them to sign on, and then your organization was then submitting it. So would that be Or you ask them to sign on and then, yeah, you submit it. Would that be direct or grassroots lobbying? It would be grassroots. So you're communicating with the public and you're giving them a mechanism to contact their legislator, which is this letter that you're submitting.
Aren't they signing on to your letter though, that you're submitting?
Yeah, so it would be similar to the petition example where you're submitting a communication that has a petition in it. And even though your organization is sending it, the time spent gathering the signatures, asking people to sign the petition, right, exactly, it would be grassroots lobbying, yeah.
Is there, Chris with Oregon Environmental Council, isn't there also something though about if you're asking only your members?
Yeah.
So you want to describe
Sure,
that?
yeah, so there's some special rules about membership. If you're telling your members to contact their legislators, it's considered direct lobbying because they're considered part of your organization. So they're not considered part of the general public. But if you ask them to contact the public, to contact their legislators, that's still grassroots lobbying. The way this really matters, other than direct or grassroots, is if you tell your members to vote yes or no on a ballot measure, that's not considered lobbying at all because they're considered part of your organization. So they're not the general public. Whereas if you told the general public, vote yes or no on a ballot measure, then that would be considered direct lobbying. So that's where having members can be valuable. And the way that the IRS defines members is anyone who contributes more than a nominal amount of time or money to the organization. So likely it'll be your donors and volunteers. There's a question here.
So when AARP tells their members how to vote on an issue, it's not lobbying?
Yeah, so I mean, AARP is also a 501c4, so they're not limited in how much they can do. But yeah, 501c3s, that's one of the reasons it can be helpful to have members, is you can, communicate with your members, and especially on ballot measures, you can do more.
And
yeah.
Can you have membership that's free so that everybody in the United States decides to join?
Well, then I don't know that they would be contributing a nominal amount of time or money to the organization.
You can't do that. You can't say, our organization has free membership, therefore everyone is a part of the organization. You can't do that to people. They have to opt in.
But even just signing up for a list is likely not enough to be considered contributing more than a nominal amount of time or money to the organization. Is there another question over here?
What if your organization is a member of a coalition that is lobbying the legislature on legislation? Does that count on your organization's sheet relative to the time that you spend as direct for you, or how does that work?
So the membership rules are when your organization is communicating with your members, not when you are a member of a coalition or another organization. So the membership rules I'm talking about are when you're communicating with your organization, members of your organization. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay. So let's say, would your answer change if the letter urged Governor Kate Brown to sign a bill banning fracking in the state? So you're not sending this to the legislature, you're sending it to the governor. Do you think it would still be lobbying? Yeah, so even though she's not a legislator, in this circumstance, she's considered a legislator because you're asking her to sign this bill. So what about if it was to Governor Brown and you're asking her to sign an executive order that imposes a moratorium on fracking? Yeah, it would not be lobbying because it's not a legislative item. It's within her power to issue an executive order. Are there any other questions about this? And we have like 10 minutes left, so just wanted to open it up. I know there's some questions about tracking. I can go into that if you want, or anything else. Just like practical tips. Yeah. There's a question over here and then over here. Or. Sorry, yeah.
If you're holding a fundraiser and you're asking people to donate specifically so you can pass a piece of legislation, is that a call to action that is a lobbying expense? Do you have to
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
If you're fundraising and asking people to donate so you can pass a piece of legislation.
Yeah. So So it's important to keep in mind, if you are fundraising for the purpose of lobbying, then those individuals are not permitted to take a tax deduction for funds that they earmark for lobbying. Earmark meaning, I'm donating for this lobbying purpose. So that's why organizations will, in most cases I've seen, just generally fundraise for the organization, because once they say, we want to get money for this specific lobbying project, that donor can no longer take a tax deduction for that.
Okay, and my other question is just more broad. Like, who is regulating this, and how do you get caught?
Yeah. So.
Because my understanding is no one really is like a complaint-based system. So.
Sure. Yeah. So the IRS is the agency that would be regulating this. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of robust enforcement as far as we can tell. We've seen a lot of cases where like some organization will raise a complaint in the media, and there'll be a news story written about it, and the organization will have to respond. So that's more typically how it would come up. So I think the more high profile you are, and maybe the more successful you are in passing legislation, maybe more people will be scrutinizing your activities. But we're not aware that the IRS is like focusing on this issue. And if there's a media complaint, maybe that's one way they'll even come to know about it, is like, oh, it looks like there's some complaint about this organization doing it. Yeah. Sure, and then I think there's a question over here too.
We talked earlier about the question about federal funding and how you need to have other funds to support your legitimate lobbying activities. And so often those funds are going to come from private donors. So those private donors are giving to a 501c3, performing as some limited amount of legitimate lobbying.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be okay for them to be taking a tax deduction on those gifts?
Yeah, if it's not earmarked for lobbying. That is, if it's not for the purpose of lobbying.
I see, okay.
So they could just provide a donation, and it's just donate to our organization. But once you say, donate to our organization because we're going to pass Medicare for all or something, then at that point, that would be earmarked for lobbying.
But if it's a C3 employee asking me to make a donation to a C4 organization, does that C3 employee's time have to be marked as lobbying? This is an actual situation for us, so.
So the C3 is saying donate to the C4 for this lobbying.
Well, it's a C3 employee
Yeah.
who spends some of their time on C3 activities, some of their time on C4 activities.
And when they're working for the C3, they're asking people to donate to the C4 for lobbying. Yeah, is that the scenario?
It's a lot more complicated than that, but let's say that is the scenario.
You know, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I can give you my card after. I can touch base later, but I'll have to look into that scenario. Yeah, I think there was a question here, right? Okay, question here. Who's first?
All right, so I'm just going to piggyback a little bit on the general fundraising real quick.
Yeah.
So let's say we have an annual fundraiser we do. We talk about everything we do for the organization over the year. We talk a little bit about things that we do, you know, maybe some legislation, you know, lobbying kind of stuff, but very, very minimal. Should I leave that out of my speech? Because everybody's giving to the organization in general, it's unrestricted funds. But if I'm talking just a tiny bit about this little piece of thing that we do, should I just...
I don't think you have to avoid mentioning that. It's fact specific. It matters whether the donation is going for this particular purpose. Okay. So that'll depend on how you word it, what people think about why they're giving and what it's going towards. Okay. So yeah, it really depends on what you're saying. Okay. But I don't think you have to leave out, when you're just generally describing what your organization does, any lobbying activities that you do. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question about how to talk to board members about this. Lots of our board members kind of remember when the Sierra Club lost their nonprofit status and that battle over the Grand Canyon. And so there's a real fear and there's a real sense of, you just can't do this. I've heard that many, many times from board members. So what's a quick and easy, kind of explanation for the fact that we can?
So one thing I'll say is we're part of this initiative called Stand By Your Mission, and it's specifically geared towards trying to educate board members about this. One thing is just providing them information on what the rules actually are, because there's a lot of misconceptions. So on our website, we have fact sheets. That's one approach. Stand By Our Mission is geared towards talking to board members. We can do trainings, but I think just clarifying what's allowable and giving them resources on that, I think, is the first step. Beyond that, if they know what the rules are and they're still cautious, I think I'm not sure in that case, but the first step is making sure they know clearly what the legal parameters are and what the sort of fake news is. Any other questions? All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to contact us. Thanks.
So I think we agreed that we're going to be able to send your slide deck out.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're going to send the slide deck. We're going to send an evaluation to all of you for today's workshop, and we'll send the slide deck to all of you as well, so you have that to refer to. That has Sean's. It has your contact information.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
The website.
Yes.
Tools,
Everything.
all on there. We also have tools on our website. So separate maybe from what AFJ promotes, we strongly promote people to take the 501H election. I advocate and lobby all the time, and I don't come anywhere near to lobbying. The expenditure would be under the 501H. So we really, would suggest that you take that if you were going to engage in some kind of lobbying and advocacy. Or
Jim, when you send out the link to the slides, can you also send out where on the NAO website
Yes.
Just because I've looked at it.
yeah, we'll do that. I'll do that. Okay. So thank you again, everybody, for coming today, and appreciate you coming. And have a good rest of the day.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.